1 week season.
Hey, welcome in OWS Fam. Glad you are with us back here in the DFS Lab. It's Showdown tonight, and that's our focus here on today's episode. Of course, this is presented by 1 week season. It is Monday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern when we are recording this tonight. It is the Falcons at the Eagles. Eagles favored by almost a touchdown minus an extra point, so they're favored by 6. Of course, as always, the purpose of this show is build a lineup on DraftKings and just use that as a vehicle to talk through the slate, or really the game, the single game for tonight. I'm your host, Cheeseman. As always, if you feel so inclined, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel. We'd love that. And with that, I'm going to bring up the man, Xandamere, to talk through the Showdown slate. But first of all, Xandamere, how was week 2 for you? Obviously, a just crazy week. Some of the things we saw happen.
Week 2 was wild. Week 2 was the chalkiest slate I have ever projected. So, I do OWS's ownership projections. I cannot remember having 3 players projected over 30% ownership in a week. Like, it was nuts how concentrated everything got because there were just so many plays in really great spots. And of course, some of those, as always, right? Some of those smashed, right? Jordan Mason did really well. Breece Hall had a solid, not elite game. Chris Godwin had a great game, and then Justin Jefferson was on his way to a great game and then got hurt.
I know.
Yeah, that
97-yard touchdown.
God, that was a lot of Justin Jefferson. That was painful. And of course, the big one though is that the Rams just absolutely fell on their faces and did nothing. Right, and like they had 3 points in the first half, or did they score at the end of the first half? No, they had 3 points the first half, and then Cooper Kupp got hurt. Right, and didn't come back, and they just looked miserable against what is not a good Arizona defense, right? Or what we had not thought of as a good Arizona defense, right? Arizona was just eviscerated by the Bills in week 1 and gave up 34. So, and that's football, right? Like that's football, and that stuff happens. Teams have bad games, teams have good games, teams surprise us. But it was a fun week. It was, I didn't do well in DFS because I'm generally sort of a team play the best plays kind of guy, and it was really hard for me to get away from the Rams without with how cheap they all were. It was just really hard for me to envision that someone on the Rams wasn't going to have a tourney viable score, and they didn't. So this is a bummer of a week for DFS for me, but our props absolutely crushed. We were up almost 10 units in props, so that made up for it. We hit. So one of the things we like doing in props in NFL is we call laddering and alternate lines. So most props are median bets, right? You bet that a guy's going to get over or under 52.5 receiving yards or whatever. But what's common though is when a guy goes over, or they often go way over, right? It's like we look for where we can find what we view as asymmetric situations where we don't want to bet on the median outcome. We want to bet on a guy going way over. And so a good example of this is we took alt lines on Rashid Shaheed on the Saints because he's much better against defenses that run heavy zone. Dallas runs really heavy zone. And so we thought that, if his median line was low, it was 38 yards or 40 yards or something like that. I don't remember because we didn't bet it. But we bet his alternate lines because we thought if he goes over, he's likely to go way over because that's his profile. He's a deep threat receiver. He's a speed guy. He's going to catch, if he hits, he's going to be hitting by catching a really long pass or two. And he did, right? And so he hit Rashid Shaheed at, I think we had 70, 80, 90 yards. And the 90-yard one was, plus 1,000. So 10 to 1, right? 10 to 1 odds. So that was fun.
Whoa.
So that made up for the DFS.
That is awesome. So you kind of you ladder it. So you're you put an amount on kind of over 40, over 50, over 60, over 70 kind of thing. So if he hits 100 yards, then you hit all of those at once kind of thing.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so, if he hit the first one we took from him was 60 yards. And we basically broke it even at 60 yards. And then we had 70, 80, 90. And so if he hits all of them, we make, a fortune. And that's an interesting way to play volatile guys who have, lower floors in their outcomes, but also higher ceilings. It's an interesting way to play that kind of volatility where, if you hit, you make more than just a single unit of your bet, right? You're not just betting a single unit on a median outcome. You're trying to hit sort of the longer shot. And so it's a way to kind of, it's sort of like thinking about regular prop betting as cash games in DFS, right? Consistent, steady, but lower return.
Exactly.
And then these are more like hitting GPPs in DFS as the analogy.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, and it's just a tiny plug to head to 1 week season and check out the props package, because I've been in there and it really is sharp, and it is nice to be. I mean, I've had those kind of weeks before too, where, and this last week was one of them for me. I wasn't a great week DFS wise. I didn't have time. I just kind of was a little bit rushed there leading up to kickoff, and so I didn't have time to get my prop bets in. But I've had weeks last season where DFS was so, but props smashed, and so you end up having a pretty good weekend overall. It can be very nice.
Yeah, it's a way to DFS is a wonderful hobby. I love DFS. I've played DFS for over 10 years. It is a volatile, endeavor, right? Like the best players in the world are not profitable every slate, every month, even every season, right? Like the vast majority of successful NFL DFS players have had an unprofitable season here or there, right? So this kind of props offers a little more consistency in managing your sort of overall sports bankroll, as I see it. And then DFS is kind of where you can try to hit some home runs.
Absolutely. Well, hey, let's jump into this Monday Night Football game here. You got the Falcons at the Eagles. Eagles are favored by about 5.5, I think is the line right now. Obviously, A.J. Brown being out, that's some big news. So kind of what's your thoughts on the A.J. Brown injury, how that's going to affect this game? And then how do you see this? Like, what do you think Vegas is telling us about how this game could go?
Yeah, so the A.J. Brown news is, well, it's frustrating. So I write the Showdown articles for the Island games, and I wrote the article. I had, I had sort of an if-then. If A.J. Brown is healthy, it looks like this. If A.J. Brown is not healthy, it looks like that. But of course, I sent it over to our editor team, and then, like an hour later, A.J. Brown is ruled out. And I was like, oh, man. But, when I wrote it up, Philly was favored by 6. So now they're favored by 5.5. And the point here is that really, like, we, as fantasy players, we get attached to the players who have fantasy impact when we're thinking about games. We get attached to the quarterbacks, the running backs, the wide receivers, the tight ends. But football teams are big, right? They have big rosters on game day. And so even as good as A.J. Brown is, what we saw is the Vegas line barely moved, right? Philly has out their best receiver, and the Vegas line went from Philly favored by 6 to favored by 5.5. And so what Vegas is telling us is that they don't think this has a material impact on the likelihood of the Eagles to win the game. And it has material impact on us as fantasy players, obviously. It's a huge impact on us, right? But we get so fixated on the fantasy guys, the guys that are fantasy relevant. These teams have a whole bunch more players who aren't fantasy relevant, but are very, very relevant for winning the game, right? Basically, the entire defenses, the offensive line, right? Like those players matter a ton for winning the game. And so, A.J. Brown being out has an impact to us, but it doesn't really change how Vegas is seeing the game and the likelihood of the Eagles to win, right? The Eagles are at home. We know the Eagles are just a strong top to bottom team. And the Falcons, right? Like the Falcons are the key to the slate more so than the Eagles, because the Falcons, like, we just don't know what they're going to look like, right? Like last year, the Falcons ran this weirdly dysfunctional Arthur Smith offense where they just didn't bother using their best players a lot of the time, but they still managed to find ways to win a fair number of games, right? They weren't like a dumpster fire. But then this year, Arthur Smith is gone. They brought in, a new coach, the new coaching staff. I think there's a lot of excitement about that. They brought in Kirk Cousins, right? Yeah. A prolific passer as a quarterback. There's a lot of excitement about the Falcons passing game, thinking they're finally going to utilize their best players, and they have a quarterback who can get the ball. And then week 1 happened, and week 1 was against Pittsburgh, and then good defense, right? But it's more so than just the good defense, right? Like if you watch that game, Kirk Cousins did not look comfortable, and he did not look mobile. And keep in mind, he's coming off a major injury at his, he's not a young guy anymore. Kirk Cousins, I don't remember how old he is. Give me one second. Gotta go look up Kirk Cousins' age, right? He's 30. Yeah, okay, 36. I was gonna guess 35. So he's 36 years old, coming off a major injury, and he did not look comfortable. They ran, they were running out of the shotgun and the pistol formations last week in order to keep Cousins back, right, and give him a little more time, as opposed to having him operate from under center where he's dropping back every play. And that tells me that he doesn't feel fully mobile back there yet. And, we hope he will, and I'm sure he will improve over the season. But the question is how much is that, how much is he going to improve from 1 week to the next week? Is it going to be night and day? Is it going to be gradual? They've got great painkiller drugs in the NFL these days. But I just, I don't know. So that's the key to the slate is like, we know what the Eagles are going to look like on offense, right? Like we don't know what the Falcons are going to look like. And so the key to the slate here is, are the Falcons going to look like they did in week 1 with a largely immobile Kirk Cousins against a pretty strong Philly pass rush and a strong Philly defensive line? Big road underdogs, which could very easily push the Falcons into a sort of one-dimensional game script, right? Like, forcing them to abandon the run. And then having an immobile quarterback dropping back every offensive play is a recipe for sacks and turnovers and just disaster. So is that what we're going to see? I don't know. Or are we going to see an offense that looks like it's quarterbacked by Kirk Cousins with 3 elite, good to elite skill position players, right? In Darnell Mooney, sorry, I have Darnell Mooney on the mind, but in Drake London, in Bijan Robinson, and Kyle Pitts, right? Like, are we going to see what we thought we were going to get in the preseason from Atlanta? And so that's what the slate hinges on. Like, Philly's going to do its thing, and we know what that offense is going to look like, and they should be able to put up points. The question is, will Atlanta be able to answer, or are they going to, struggle to move the ball at all as they did against Pittsburgh last week?
Do you think, and we're just about to jump into building this lineup, but do you think the only, like, if Philly gets out to a big lead, say they get out to a 14-0 lead, and Atlanta is basically forced into a, like, we've got to just get aggressive and try and catch up. Like, sometimes you think, hey, I'm just going to, like, take Atlanta because they're going to be passing the whole game, takes, Kirk Cousins, some pass catchers. Is that scenario a good scenario for Atlanta where Philly can open up their pass rush? Or for Atlanta to succeed, does this need to stay close, in your opinion?
I think that's a very good question, and I'm not sure there's a correct answer there. And what I mean by that is, like, let's go through the scenarios. If Atlanta keeps the game close, they can run a balanced offense. They can lean heavily on Bijan. We're assuming here that Kirk Cousins is still not fully mobile, right? He's still kind of a little hampered. That can lean on the run game. They can, and that affords them, a diverse offense affords them some confusion on the Philly defense. Philly has to guess at what's coming, right? If Atlanta's not signaling its plays, they can't just rush. They can't just rush the quarterback and blitz constantly. If you're facing a quarterback who can't move around very well as a defense, you want to be aggressive, right? You want to get after him. You want to be blitzing heavily because he's going to have a hard time getting out of the way, right? Like, but if Atlanta can run their run game, then that counters the blitz and it forces Philly to not just blitz every play. But the counterpoint to that, as you mentioned, is if Atlanta falls behind and is forced to start airing it out more, pass volume is predictive of fantasy success, especially in DK's point per reception format. The question is if Atlanta will be able to successfully do that or not. My leaning is they're going to struggle to do that. And that's just based on, like, I don't think it's likely that we're going to see Kirk Cousins have sort of a night and day difference in how mobile and how comfortable he looks in the pocket in 1 week. I think it's likely to be a more gradual, ramp up for Cousins into full health and full mobility. And so what I fear here for Atlanta is if they fall behind, they are going to end up getting sort of their ears pinned back by the Philly defense. And yes, they will be passing a lot at a high pass rate, but in order to actually generate a lot of pass attempts, you still need to sustain drives. You need first downs, right? If you're going 3 and out, even if all 3 of those are passes each drive, like you're not going to rack up a ton of passing attempts and a ton of passing yardage for your receivers. So you could easily see a scenario in which Atlanta falls behind, is forced to kind of abandon the run and go very pass heavy, but is still unable to generate enough passing volume to drive fantasy success because they're going 3 and out all the time because Kirk Cousins can't get the ball out in time, and Philly's pass rush is in his face every play. So like that's what I fear is that Atlanta is likely in store for if they fall behind. But, we've always got to be humble in this game. We always have to be. The Saints just eviscerating the Cowboys at home reminded us of that, right? Like, We've always got to be humble in this game because we know what we think is likely. But these games are played on the field by athletes giving it their all. And, underdogs win all the time. Things go in ways we don't expect all the time. And so as a showdown player, it's really important to think about what kind of showdown player are you? Are you the player who wants to build for, what is most likely to win, what is most likely to land in first place, even though in those scenarios, in the what is most likely to win scenario, you're more likely splitting that first place pot with a larger number of lineups. You might win first and get 10K or 20K in the giant GPPs. Or are you willing to take more aggressive stands, more contrarian stands that reduce your chances of winning, but also lower your lineup duplication, so that if and when you do win, you might split it with one or two people or a solo win. And that's that's the question you need to answer if you're yourself as a showdown player. And that's a question of risk tolerance, of bankroll, and it's a spectrum, right? It's a gradient of where do you want to fall in that spectrum of sort of risk and how you think about building your lineups for duplication versus likelihood to win. That's what we have to figure out as players, is where on that spectrum are we comfortable? Are you comfortable going an entire season without sniffing first place because you're building in a highly contrarian way, or the thing you value the most is unique lineups? Can your bankroll sustain that? Can you right. psychologically sustain that? Or are you more comfortable hitting smaller, trying to more consistently hit smaller wins and knowing that you're not going to get that $1 million first place finish where you have the unique lineup, as we saw in Thursday night's game? You're not going to get that, but you're also not going to have the sort of like wild bankroll swings that sort of play style leads you to.
Right. No, yeah, great thoughts. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of my thought too, was just I keep remembering last season when Kirk Cousins was with the Vikings and they played the Eagles on Monday night. And I think the Vikings were, or maybe it was 2 years ago, I forget, but Kirk threw like 3 interceptions or something like that, and the pass rush got to him. So, okay, I'm on DraftKings now, and as far as contests, I'm looking at this hard count one right here. This is one actually I play quite a bit. It's got about 1,200 entries. Did you want to go something like that, like 3 entry, or like more of a larger field here?
Let's do. When I am building lineups by hand, I tend to prefer the smaller ones. So let's do the hard count. I think that's a good size for building, a hand build, for building something where you're trying to go a little bit different, but not having to get sort of like way off the board in order to think about winning, or in order to think about winning without massive duplication, right? Like that's a good size. And do you mind, I don't know, if it's okay with you, if we have time, I'd like to actually go through like a couple of different lineup builds, because as I see it, like when I'm building main slate, for example, I will often try to get to like my one favorite lineup. In Showdown, I'm trying to cover different scenarios, and that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And so like I like to look at like things from a couple different ways. And so I think that might be helpful for people if that's okay, if we have time. And I think
let's do it.
Get through it quick.
I don't think the viewers or the listeners will be upset about building more than one lineup here.
Yeah, so both these lineups are going to center around the idea that the Eagles win the game and that they win it fairly handily. And so this is like when you're building showdown lineups, you want to think about this. This is the starting point: is what do you think happens in this game, right? So like these lineups are predicated on Eagles win, and they do so pretty convincingly, right? The Falcons are going to struggle to move the ball, and so what we're looking for here are Eagles heavy rosters with like 4 or 5 Eagles and only 1 or 2 Falcons coming back. And so like that's how we'll think about this one. Or both of these. Love actually.
It. All right. And so where do you, or yeah, go ahead.
So in what I call an onslaught build is, like 5-1, right? Like 5 players from one team, one player from the other. In an onslaught build, the most common captains are the running back and the quarterback. As the most common optimal captain. And quarterbacks don't often find their way into being optimal captains in a showdown, especially on DraftKings. More so on FanDuel they do, but on DraftKings they usually don't. But in this case, we have a rushing quarterback, which raises his floor and ceiling, and B, when there aren't as many players scoring on the other team, it tends to also diminish the like really high ceiling wide receiver performances that we often see. The reason why quarterbacks often aren't optimal on DraftKings is that when the quarterback has a big game, usually he's outscored by one of his wide receivers. And so that certainly could happen, right? Especially with AJ Brown out, that narrows the Philly target distribution. So I think that Devonta Smith is a fine captain choice. But for this one, we're going to start with Jalen Hurts at captain. And think that, and you can easily run Saquon here too, right? Like that's, if you're building Onslaught builds, the two captains I'd want the most exposure to are Hurts and Saquon, as those are the guys who are they have the most touchdown equity, and they're the most likely to, especially Saquon, like running later in the game, right? As Philly will take their foot off the gas. Philly is a team that will slow things down when they're out to a big lead in the second half, and so they'll lower their pass rate significantly. So Saquon is also a very fine captain choice in here. But we're going to go with Hurts for this one. Now, if we go Hurts, what that tells us is he's either scoring at least one rushing touchdown, or he's passing for a couple of touchdowns, or ideally both, right? So if he's passing for a couple of touchdowns, we need some Philly pass catchers, right? I would never run Hurts, even a rushing quarterback like Hurts. In order for him to really hit his ceiling, he's going to need to bring a pass catcher along with him. It's going to be someone on Philly catching a touchdown. And so without AJ Brown, and with a quarterback captain who's expensive, now I'm also looking at my salary remaining. Right? When I start with an expensive captain, I start looking, okay, well, where do I go for salary relief? And I'm going to go for Dallas Goedert at 5,800 is my next pick.
All right.
And the rationale here is, like, Devonta Smith is a great receiver, and he's a great play in this game without AJ Brown. Right? That ups his volume expectation. He's also likely going to be tangling for most of the game with AJ Terrell, the Falcons' top cornerback, who is no joke, right? And I don't generally like shy away too much from like individual cornerback matchups, because teams move receivers around. They can design creative plays to get them off of the primary cornerback that might be trying to shadow them. Like, they can design plays to get around that, but it is a factor. And at least for the next pick, I want to put in Goddard, because I also want the salary relief. And if we can manage to get to Devonta Smith also, that would be great. Now, the next pick will be Saquon. And this is because in 5-1 Onslaught builds, when 5-1 Onslaught builds win, the winning team's RB1 is in the optimal lineup. And I haven't looked at the data for a little bit, but it's something like 80+% of the time.
Oh,
so,
okay.
When a 5-1 Onslaught build wins, the RB1 of the winning team is in the optimal lineup over 80% of the time. I'm just repeating that because it's a very relevant statistic. So if you're building Onslaught builds, you should think about the RB1 role, both as captain and in flex, because again, one is the team is likely to slow down their pass rate, right? Like in the second half, if they're just dominating. And two, RBs have high floors because they're handling a lot of touches. High touchdown equity. If you're building an Onslaught, there's not a lot of touchdowns to go around because only one team is scoring the touchdowns, and the running back has really high touchdown equity. So I'm very comfortable with Saquon as my next pick. And then
love it.
And then the fourth pick is going to be Eagles defense. And this should start to, this is going to look like this. So far, we are not looking like anything really off the board here, right? So we're looking at Eagles defense because, again, remember the philosophy, the idea of how this game plays out is Cousins isn't mobile. Cousins struggles to throw the ball. He's going to drop back a lot because he's going to have to try to throw the ball, but the Eagles are going to be in his face. That means sacks. That means turnovers. Also at 5-1 Onslaught builds, defense is in the winning lineup over 40% of the time. So it's somewhere between 40 and 50.
I love these data points that you've got going on here. These are really profound data points.
Honestly, I wish I'd planned this a little better in advance, and next time I will, because I would have gone and looked up this data to make sure I have it exact, because I'm doing this off of memory. But I have all the data, it's just buried in courses and such. But next, I planned this out in advance well enough. So next time I will do this. I will make sure to have precise data. But yeah, 5-1 Onslaught builds defense is optimal over somewhere between 40 and 50% of the time. Eagles D is probably projecting. I'm still fiddling with ownership projections, but I have them around 27% right now. So that's a position I probably, and in Onslaught builds, high owned defenses scare me in Showdown because defense is so volatile. But in Onslaught builds, I want to be overweight that 27% number. So now we have 2 spots left, and we have 7,100, and there's a couple ways we could go. Excuse me. So one thing you'll see commonly in Onslaught builds is kickers are popular in Onslaught builds because they can score points in different ways. But kickers are a little trickier when you have a quarterback captain, because quarterbacks score most of their points not through yardage, but through touchdowns. right? Like if a quarterback throws for 250 yards, that's only 10 points, right? Like whereas a receiver catching, that's 5 for 50 from a pass catcher. And we know that we need Hurts to outscore his pass catchers in order for this lineup to work. So we know that we need touchdowns. And so when I'm using quarterback captain in an onslaught build, I tend to shy away a little bit more from the kicker because I need those drives to be converted into touchdowns and not field goals in order for the quarterback to win. If I was using Saquon or say Devonta Smith captain in this onslaught build, I would much more heavily consider Jake Elliott as the pick here, because Saquon and Devonta Smith can be the optimal captain, the highest scoring player, more through yardage, right? They could get one touchdown, but a whole bunch of yards, and they could get there and be the optimal captain, be the highest scoring player of the game. But for Hurts, he needs touchdowns. So I don't want Elliott because, Hurts needs touchdowns. Elliott needs field goals. Those are inversely correlated. So now the question is, do I want another Eagle in here? Do I want to do 5-1 or do I want to do 4-2 Eagles? And I think for this one, I'm going to go for 5-1. Excuse me. And so there are really only a couple of options if I don't want the kicker, right? We're running out of Eagles. I could do Devonta Smith, or I could do, if you scroll down a little bit, the next most logical one would be Jahan Dotson, who is the likeliest receiver to fill in and see, increased snaps due to AJ Brown missing. Or I could do sort of a punt play. I could play like a Kenneth Gainwell or even and if I was doing large field, I would say you could consider someone like a Will Shipley here, who might get extra run late in the game. If the Phillies are really crushing, they might decide to rest Saquon and put Shipley in. So in large field stuff, I might make a play like a Shipley, or to sort of a total punt play like a Britton Covey, who could get lucky and catch a touchdown on limited snaps. Or maybe we're wrong about Dotson. Maybe Covey's the one who sees a snap increase due to Brown being out. I doubt it, but you never know. We could be wrong. We don't know how these teams operate yet when players are missing. But this is a smaller field tournament. And so in a smaller field tournament, I'm really limited to Devonta Smith or Jahan Dotson. And Smith is obviously the sort of correct play here in a vacuum. He's going to project for a lot more points. But what I'm concerned about here now at this point is the differentiation of this lineup, right? Like we're only playing a relatively small field contest, only 1,000-ish people, but Philly heavy builds are going to be popular because they're large favorites, right? So if you're already going to see a lot of Philly heavy builds. We're going to have a lot of Jalen Hurts captain, so that's not exactly a very contrarian choice. He's going to be one of the 2 or 3 highest owned captains. And so putting Smith in there, now you could put Smith in there and it'll just pop him in there really quick.
Yep,
if you would.
Absolutely.
And so if we pop Smith in there, we have 5,400, and now you need a Falcon. And so the most logical Falcon, guess who's 5,400, would be Darnell Mooney. But I bet this lineup will be duplicated. So if you plug in Darnell Mooney, right, it'd be $0 remaining.
Exactly. And the 50K salary cap, it increases the likelihood of duplication.
Yeah, you're using your full salary cap. So like this lineup, I can say with confidence, even in a relatively small 1,000 entry contest, this lineup I'm pretty confident will be duplicated. This is a pretty solid lineup. And so if we go back to the philosophy of Showdown, if you're the kind of player who wants to, who doesn't worry about duplication, and you're just like, I just want to maximize my odds of being first, I like this lineup. But even in a 1,000-person contest, I like to think somewhat about duplication. And I'm not going to get super crazy. I'm not going to play a backup QB or something nuts like that. So let's take Devonta Smith and Darnell Mooney out, and let's go a slightly different direction. Let's put in Dotson. So now we have 10,200. So we can't play Bijan. We could play Cousins, although a solo, like a quarterback by himself who is a pure pocket passer who doesn't run, is very rarely the optimal bring back on a 5-1 build, because it's just highly, highly likely that one of his receivers is going to outscore him. So like imagine Cousins throws for 2 touchdowns, right? And that's all that Atlanta scores. Well, if those 2 touchdowns go to one guy, then that one guy is going to outscore Cousins, right? Yep. If the 2 touchdowns go to 2 separate guys, then it's likely that a 5-1 onslaught is not optimal, because one of those 2 guys and Cousins will probably be in the optimal lineup, right?
Right.
And so you have to think about how the scoring is distributed. And so now I think we can put in one of Atlanta's players, though. Like, so we can't do Bijan, we can't do Cousins, and so let's put in Drake London. And so Drake London is their alpha wide receiver. He had a slow week 1, but all of Atlanta had a slow week 1. Kyle Pitts got the touchdown, but I am concerned that Kyle Pitts might actually just not be that good at football. And I'm not like a watch the tape expert guy, but like I lean on, Hilo and Mike Johnson, two of our OWS experts for that kind of stuff. And they're somewhat concerned that Kyle Pitts just might not be that good at football in terms of like watching how he runs routes, how he goes after the football. Like they have some concerns there. And so I will share those concerns. So this lineup is, probably it's slightly weaker than the Devonta Smith Mooney lineup in terms of raw like point projection. But I think that you're going to find the pairing of London Dotson is going to be significantly lower owned than the pairing of Smith Mooney. And we're also going to get some differentiation because this lineup leaves $2,400 of salary on the table. And the farther down you go in salary, the more differentiation you get because most people are either building with optimizers, and optimizers don't like leaving salary on the table for complicated reasons. I can get into this more in another video, but we're already running long. Or and hand builders don't like leaving salary on the table because it feels uncomfortable. Because it feels like it feels like, oh, there's got to be a way I can upgrade this. Where can I have salary left? Where can I upgrade? Right? Like, and you can see someone saying maybe I can upgrade. What if I take Dotson down to so and I can upgrade Goddard to Devonta Smith? Like, it's easy to look at this and say like, where can I upgrade? So I think this is a pretty robust Philly captained, Philly Onslaught lineup where you have, Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, the two guys most likely to score touchdowns for Philly. You have the tight end one whose role is boosted by no AJ Brown. You've got Dotson, who is the guy most likely to step into Brown's role. We don't have Devonta Smith. We're sort of hypothesizing here that the Falcons are going to be able to focus on Smith with AJ Terrell and kind of constrain him from having a big game. We got Eagles D, which is just going to smash Cousins in the face. And we have Drake London, who's the primary receiver for the Falcons coming back. So this is a lineup that, in a large field contest, this lineup would probably be duplicated, but it's still a pretty robust lineup if you want to bet on the Eagles, crushing the Eagles winning the game handily. So this is a lineup I think is, if our scenario of Eagles win handily comes to pass, I think this is a strong contender for like how that game plays out in a way that's favorable to us.
Okay, let's do another one here. So we just finished that one. Obviously, the Hurts captain lineup with the Eagles Onslaught build. What direction do you want to go with this one?
So I still want to go Eagles heavy because I kind of want to look at I'm trying to think of this as like a learning exercise, and I want to focus on sort of one game scenario and multiple ways to build for that game scenario. So let's go Eagles heavy, but we're going to start it slightly differently. And this time we're going to start with the guy we left out in the last one, which is Devonta Smith. And, I mentioned that he's going to be facing AJ Terrell a fair bit. That's a tough matchup for him. And it's true, right? Those things are true. But I think that Devonta Smith is an incredibly talented receiver. Obviously, without, AJ Brown, that's a massive increase in opportunity for him. And the Eagles can creatively work to scheme him, away from AJ Terrell if they so desire. They were, in preseason and then in week 1, they were running him out of the slot a lot, which is super exciting and kind of like the CeeDee Lamb, Cooper Kupp sort of, route tree, which is also really difficult to defend, to shadow. So, I think let's start with Devonta Smith captain. He's obviously going to be popular captain choice. That's okay. And now we're going to put in Jalen Hurts because, again, this is
how to do it. Generally
speaking, especially in smaller tournaments, when I have a pass catcher as my captain, I want their quarterback, right? Because if the pass catcher has a big game, that their quarterback is generating points through the same plays, right? A touchdown helps both of them. So in larger field, I will sometimes try to get contrarian by having pass catcher captain without the quarterback, because that can work, right? That can hit. Roughly 70-ish% of the time, when a pass catcher is the optimal captain, their quarterback is also in the lineup. And so that still leaves a good, I think it's like 25-30% where it's not. In the old days of Showdown, the leverage was always forcing the quarterback because a lot of people didn't realize these sort of correlations. And so in the first year or two of Showdown, you would have pass catcher with their quarterback was only used at the field at 50 or 60%. And so the positive leverage was to always force it. But now as people have gotten, more sophisticated at how to think about Showdown, it's kind of the other way, actually, where so many people have hard rules that say if using pass catcher captain must include quarterback, that in large field play, you can actually get some positive leverage by not doing that. So, but in small field, we don't need to take that risk. And so we're going to put Hurts in. The guy who I think we're going to fade this time is going to be, the other key passing piece of the lineup, and we're not going to put in Dallas Goedert, who I really like this week, really like in this game, but we're not going to use Dallas Goedert. And the reason why is, in order for Devonta Smith to be the optimal captain, he has to capture a disproportionate share of the Philadelphia passing offense, right? If Devonta Smith and Dallas Goedert both have really big games, then it's likely that Jalen Hurts is the optimal captain, right? It's like the more the offense is spread out, the more it's likely the quarterback is the optimal captain. The more the offense is concentrated, the more likely it is that the skill position player is the optimal captain. And so I often use a rule in Showdown of, when captaining a pass catcher, no more than one other pass catcher on the same team, because I need the production to really flow through the main guy I'm using. Let's put Saquon, and we won't go through that again, right? We already talked in detail about why we like the running back. And then let's put Eagles D, because again, this is a smaller field contest. I'm sticking with what I know works consistently. So now we have 4 Eagles. This one I'm going to do a little bit differently, because what I want in this one is a 4-2 build, not a 5-1 build. And so now I'm going to say, let's go Drake London, because he is my favorite Falcon. Okay. And again, I'll and then scroll down and let's put in Ray McLeod. Okay. And so this is the sort of sneakier pick in this roster, right? I think that the first 4 picks, right? Devonta Smith, Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, Eagles D. That's going to be a fairly common starting point for Eagles onslaught builds, right? Those guys are going to be really popular. Devonta Smith's going to be one of the probably 3-4 most popular captains. And so I want to think about differentiation. Drake London is too cheap, right? So he's going to be popular. So I want to think about differentiation. Ray McLeod saw 7 targets last week. He only played 50% of the snaps. He was operating as the wide receiver 3. He was splitting time with the Atlanta tight end 2, who what's his name? Charlie Warner. Sorry, okay. Charlie Warner. And they were sort of splitting time, where Warner was playing when Atlanta was running 12 personnel, and Ray McLeod was playing when they were running 11 personnel. So what we're thinking here is Atlanta's going to need to take to the air more. They're going to need to throw more. That's going to open up potentially more volume for the pass catchers. And we're thinking that they're not going to be able to connect deep to Mooney, right? And I think Mooney's a fine play, by the way. But in this scenario, we're saying they're not going to be able to connect deep to Mooney. They're going to have to keep going underneath, right? Because Kirk Cousins, again, immobile, Philly pass rush in his face, going to be looking short. And so we're looking at Ray McLeod as the guy who's running short routes, who can rack up, some PPR points, some point per dollar, some point per reception points here. If he can rack up, 4, 5, 6 catches, even without a ton of yardage, in a lower scoring game, he can still pop off as an optimal piece, even if he's not a full-time player. And there's also you start getting into the weirder late game scenarios too, and thinking, okay, what happens if late in the game Atlanta's really down? They decide that, hey, at some point we might pull London, we might pull Pitts, but they're probably going to keep using McLeod, right? He's not one of their main guys, and so he's the kind of guy who could get sort of some of the mop-up work to help finish out the game at the end and keep racking up points. So this one's not the full onslaught, it's not the 5-1, but I like this build because I think it's kind of an onslaught in terms of salary allocation. And when I think of onslaught, I think of both number of roster spots you allocate to each team, but also salary, because you got $50,000 in salary, and essentially how much of it are you giving to one team versus the other? We've got roughly 80% of our salary allocated to the Eagles here, right? Just shy of 40,000. So, we're saying that the Eagles are going to generate the vast majority of the fantasy points in this game. So we've got this, we've got Jalen Hurts with only 1 pass catcher, basically saying that the disproportionate share of the passing game work flows through Devonta Smith, which I think is, entirely plausible. We got Saquon as running back, but, big role, good touchdown equity, could get a lot of work if the Eagles are up by a lot. Eagles D for the reasons we discussed earlier. Then we've got Drake London and Ray McLeod. Both those guys are kind of guys who could really rack up PPR points. And so even though it's not 5-1, I still this roster tells the similar story of the Eagles win the game handily. It just tells a story of the Eagles win the game handily, but their fantasy production is a little more concentrated in fewer players than the first lineup that was 5-1.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, this is great stuff, Xandamere. I'm like, as soon as we get done recording this, I'm gonna get this show up for the people on YouTube, and then man, I'm ready to like dive in and start. Like, I'm pumped for this game now. Talking with you. Any other closing thoughts before we ship this out?
I'd love to hear. I don't do a lot of these shows, right? I do the show once a week with Hilo, but I'm not usually a show person. I'd love to hear from our listeners about what's helpful to you, right? Like how I've been thinking about this is I want to talk, especially in these sort of earlier season editions of these, talking a little more high level, a little more about strategy, a little more about sort of the history of like the data we have in Showdown and what works and what doesn't work, or what's historically worked or not worked, and how we're thinking about, are those trends going forward? Are they trends in the past? Or I talked about like the, pairing your quarterback with, or pairing your pass catcher captain with your quarterback as being something you wanted to force in the early days of Showdown, but maybe not so much now because how players are building rosters has changed. So I'd love to hear from our listeners what's helping. Where you'd like us to spend more time and what's not, right? Like we can take it. We're tough guys. Tell us,
Right.
Tell us what's not as helpful, because at the end of the day, we're building the show not just to feel good about ourselves, right? We're building the show to help people who are listening to it to get sharper at Showdown, to find success here. So help us, understand what's working for you and what's not, and what directions we can go in the future.
That's right. Absolutely. Let us know in, the 1 week season Discord. You can let us know in the comments below the video. So Xandamere, great stuff. Sharp analysis as always. I hope you take down something huge tonight. Good luck tonight. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck to you as well.
Awesome. And folks, with that, that'll wrap us up for the DFS Lab. Again, good luck tonight on Showdown, and make sure to catch the show tomorrow. Hilo will be on tomorrow for the lab. See you guys next time.